Welcome everybody as Storm Eowyn approaches to the annual CHACR conference. I'd like to thank our panels of discussants who have made it. Sir Tim Radford, Dr. Sebastian Pender, who will kick us off. And then Professors Tracy Gurman, Ali Ansari and Edward Howell and Henry Boyd, who will do the second session for us. Thank you for continuing to give us your friendship, support and wisdom, as you have done variously over the years. And thank you all here and online for spending time with us. The raison d'etre of the CHACR is to get the Army to think a little bit more deeply than it habitually does about itself, about its context and about the profession of arms. And by joining in today, either virtually or physically, you're doing just that. And I think that that's important. So what are we discussing today? Well, two things really, in a nutshell, I suppose. One is the interesting, and I use interesting in that Chinese cursed sense of may you live in interesting times, the interesting context in which we find ourselves. And as our title suggests, secondly, the so what for the UK and the so what for the British Army. The programme in brief is a few opening remarks from myself and, as you'll see in a moment, CGS. The first discussion, a coffee break, second discussion, a few closing remarks from me now instead of Shashank, and then we're all on our way. But before I open up that first discussion, I'm delighted to be able to ask General Sir Ollie Walker, the CGS, to open up today's proceedings. He was intending to be here today. His diary has changed. He sends his apologies, as you'll see in a moment, but he was very keen to kick things off in person today and asked if he could do so by a recorded video message, which he's been kind enough to do, offering us a short welcome and an opening salvo. So without further ado, let's hand over to him.
Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests and revered old friends, it's my great pleasure in welcoming you to this annual conference, and I'm only sorry not to be with you in person. I am in fact overseas, visiting British Army troops deployed. And as you'll understand, I need to take every opportunity I can to do this. In fact, I've just returned from Poland and places proximate, where I've seen at first hand the contribution our troops are making to support the Ukrainian armed forces in their heroic defense against an unjustified invasion. And I was in Estonia just before Christmas, where they are equally on point for the reality of NATO's forward defense policy. All pretty sobering stuff, as I'm sure you can imagine. So continuing with the theme, I am today in Europe, in France, the Alps to be precise, visiting winter troops in their winter training, where I hope to find them sober, not least because it takes enormous steel for novices to compete in downhill races on Olympic courses with only a few weeks of preparation. And I feel that the least I can do is to be there to witness their courage, as well as thank those who organise and sponsor these events for the benefit of our soldiers. So excuses over, I'm genuinely sorry not to be with you. I am, of course, delighted that the conference is taking place at the Royal Military Academy. It is the forge from which the British Army's leaders are fashioned. And our ambition is for this place to become a centre of leadership, training and education, not just for us in the Army or in the wider armed forces, but also for the nation. So strongly do we believe in the motto of serve to lead. But that is another discussion for another time. But it's fitting, given the question to discuss today is, so what for Britain? Before I get to a few opening remarks, I must thank Professor Andrew Stewart and his team for bringing you all here today, as well as the brilliant brains who have come together to ask the difficult questions and help signpost a route through the challenging external environment within which we, as soldiers, must be prepared to fight and win the nation's battles from the land. Thank you. We really can't do this without you. It is one defence for the nation. So, to the context, as I'm sure the Strategic Defence Review will report shortly, we are in a new era. Some have referred it to as a new nuclear age, and perhaps even a third era for NATO. Brighter, wiser, and more informed commentators than I are more than covering this in print and on the airways, so I won't attempt to lay it out. Suffice to say that to me, defence and security seems to be front and centre of some of the really big policy choices that governments around the world are facing. So we, as the national security and military professionals, have a duty to advise them on their options and to be ready to implement their decisions as efficiently and effectively as we can. So we have been doing the former in a very open and collegiate way with the Defence Review's external review team. Notwithstanding the government's commitment to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, I think it's inevitable that they will conclude that there are some very hard choices that need to be confronted to match the threats we face today. Change is coming, with transformation of the armed forces through innovation and integration as the theme. Expect to see a top-down drive to accelerate the use of autonomous and uncrewed systems, also in placing data and software at the heart of our fighting system, and a push for a new partnership between technicians and tacticians, and between the private and the public sector. So I think One Defence goes wider and deeper. All of which, to my mind, completely validates the direction of travel of Future Soldier as the conceptual foundation for the future of fighting power in and from the land, alongside the land operating concept as the way we will fight and win in the future. And I have to say, much of the credit for that goes to many of you in the room here today. Britain really has got the best thinkers on the business of war and the profession of arms, and we now need to turn that into practical and tactical fighting power. Simply put, what is thought must be taught for it to be real, and therein lies hard-edged deterrent credibility. And I don't think time is a sanctuary anymore, but that's a personal view. But given my professional position, it's why my challenge to the Army, to wider defence, as well as industry, and therefore perhaps even to this conference, is actually to accelerate the modernisation of our land forces so that we can field those fifth-generation versions that set the joint force up for the most unfair of fights, and to do that sooner than we thought possible. So doubling our fighting power by 27, tripling it by the end of the decade. And we have a plan for that, and we are kicking on. So I'm already looking forward to reading the conclusion of your conversations, which will no doubt beg more questions than answer. But that is, after all, the scientific method, and we are all the richer for it. Enjoy. Thank you.
Good start. Could I ask you two to join us up front for the first discussion? And the way we'll play the two sessions today, before and after coffee, is prepared remarks, about 10 minutes each, from those of us sitting up the front on the subjects which I'll guide you through in a moment, and then a proper discussion with you here in the room and online if we feel the need, if there's either something brilliant asked online or if the discussion dries up in the room, which I can't believe that it will. This first session lasting about an hour or so. As I said in my opening remarks, I sort of need to start by offering apologies. They've asked me to offer apologies from Leslie Vinjamuri, Mike Cox and Mike Clark, who were going to give us that broader context. I'll do my best to set that conversation up, but that means that you in the room, in your question and answer session with us, need to probe all those areas of context that will set up the discussion this afternoon, or the second discussion, rather, covering China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. Sitting alongside me, first of all, I've got General Sir Tim Radford, Senior Counsel of the Cohen Group, one of the 11 senior counsels of the Cohen Group, alongside the likes of General Mattis and George Robertson. Sir Tim served 40 years in the Army, commanding wonderfully in every rank, from second lieutenant to 4-star, spending 10 years in the Special Forces and over 11 years on operations, which is, on reflection, I'm good at maths, over a quarter of your service spent on ops. His final appointment was the CHACR, the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which I found to my dismay when I was the bag carrier years ago of the then CHACR, General Sir Rupert Smith, who'd asked me to get something from the BBC. I rang the BBC and thought that they'd be a wise organisation, that if I said I represent the CHACR, they'd know exactly what I was talking about, and spoke to a very clearly well-educated, erudite young lady who said, CHACR, what is that? And I said, the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And she went, ooh, fancy, what is that? And I said, well, have you ever heard of General Montgomery? And she said, oh, you mean the geezer who won the Second World War? And I said, interesting view, something like that. But once he'd won the Second World War, his final appointment, before he finally left the army, was as the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And she went, oh, important then. So, Tim, thank you very much for joining us. And alongside him, Dr. Sebastian Pender, a fellow at CHACR, thank you so much for standing in alongside me to cover the ground supposed to be covered by the others, but actually importantly to add another angle in. Sebastian's a research fellow here at CHACR with an outstanding research track record, appointments at Balliol College, Oxford, SOAS, University of London, and the International Centre of Advanced Studies at Delhi. And his current experience, as you'll see in a moment, covers the shifting dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. So I'm going to attempt to fill that gap. And then Sir Tim will talk to us on alliances. And it just strikes me that NATO has been the stated foundation of our security since the 1950s, but I'm still unconvinced that we do much more than lip service to that. I was very struck. We had a NATO conference here at CHACR a few years ago, and sitting in the front of the conference was the commander of the ARC, then Ed Smith Osborne, and there were lots of people in the room in British Army uniform saying, who's the 3-star there? What does he do? The Corps Commander, the pinnacle of operational command. And the fact that the ARC Corps Commander was someone that people weren't, who's that guy? On a NATO conference, I found quite interesting. So Tim's going to explore for us how much the genuine commitment, participation, understanding of alliances in general, NATO in particular, are important. Sebastian, in a world of increasingly solidifying sides, if you like, will give us pause for thought by considering the global role of the powerful, influential, but uncommitted, particularly through the lens of India and the Indo-Pacific. And hopefully, after a few words from me and from them and a conversation with you, that will then set us up to look later on at those who are committed but opposed to us. So, some opening thoughts from me. I'm struck, first of all, by the Patrick Sanders 1937 moment conversation that he started when he took over as Chief of the General Staff, and the urge not just to the army but to the nation to mobilise. And frankly, how thinly understood the point that he was making was. Even in the most educated of the media, the discussion very quickly went into Army Chief talks about mobilisation and national service, which he'd never mentioned, and no bothering to interrogate once that line of media had been started. The media went into its own frenzy of congratulating itself on having a discussion without actually getting under the skin of what he was saying. What he also usefully did was to get the army to refocus on the purpose of the army, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But to be ready to fight and win the nation's wars on land surely is not a difficult thing to get your head around and to agree. But those that have done the generalship course and those that are about to do the generalship course in this room, when Jonathan Trevor from Oxford comes and talks about purpose and alignment, every year the 12 or 14 new generals who sit in this room have quite an aggressive discussion with each other about what the purpose of the army is. And you see Professor Trevor sitting there with his head in his hands, going, how can you not understand that it won't change, that it's always, you might change how you go about it, but the purpose won't change. So to have a CGS to say, look, be ready, and there's a clue in every word, be ready to fight and win the nation's wars from land. And then to have the next CGS, General Rowley, when he came in, to say, so when asked, so what would you like to do with the purpose of the army? To say, sorry, did you not understand what my predecessor said? How can that change? It remains the same. Stop fiddling with it. It's quite clear. That sets up the context for the army to be thinking about what they do. So Rowley's opening line was, Patrick was right, not I've arrived so we can all change. And all he's done to change the approach is to talk about accelerating that mobilisation, accelerating that modernisation through a confirmed purpose. And as you've just heard, to become twice and then 3 times as lethal in 3 and 6 years, respectively. And actually, if you read anything that he's saying, he's not just talking the physical component of fighting power. He's talking morally and he's talking conceptually as well. And he's talking about a new relationship with the nation, politics, polity, and business that makes that a doable thing. All of that for the army within an increasingly fractious, dangerous, and unpredictable global context. As we'll hear in the second discussion after coffee, there is a new alignment between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And without stealing any of their sandwiches, and it's a sort of trite for me to say, but it strikes me that Russia is led by an individual with a particular worldview, which is not a Putin worldview, is a Russian worldview. Remove him and it'll just be somebody else with the same view, who is aggressive in his outlook, expansionist in his outlook, dictatorial, and inevitably concerned with his own safety and future, and has thus pared away from around him all those with any talent who might replace him, and is not necessarily terribly well and not necessarily going to be there forever. But that strikes me as a very dangerous combination of things. An aging dictatorial person that's pared away talent and has an aggressive view of the world. Delete Putin, insert Xi. Delete Putin and Xi, insert Khamenei. And into that threesome, insert Kim Jong-un. And that makes, for me, a very unpredictable and solidifying context against which we are operating. And it strikes me over the 10 or 11 years that CHACR has been actively involved with Whitehall, that the messaging has changed in Whitehall from about 10 years ago. That might be so, but quietly, please, because we want to avoid that sort of talk. Imagine how awful it would be if we said Russia might be a threat. To a Whitehall that is becoming, I won't say comfortable, but is becoming more able to have that conversation. And not just Whitehall, but if you spend any time in Ballard, Paris is having the same conversation. Washington is having the same conversation in various different ways. But we'll explore that later. But it strikes me that it's also a world of flashpoints right now. Take just Syria, for example. We don't need to re-rehearse what's happened in Syria. Not necessarily a surprise, but at least the speed of the collapse was a surprise. But it's the knock-on effects of that I find particularly interesting. There's a knock-on effect in Russia, obviously. I'll explore that in my closing remarks. But there's a knock-on effect in Turkey, isn't there? And therefore on NATO. So there's a knock-on effect in Turkey, in NATO, and in Russia. There's a knock-on effect in Kurds that slop over into Turkey and into Iraq and into Syria, and that's a fractious dynamic. Hezbollah in country and from Iran. Israel. Their reaction was interesting, wasn't it, in the first 48 hours? All of that is fractious, unstable, and difficult. And that's just one example. And you can layer on Israel and Hamas and Taiwan and almost anywhere in in Africa and in most of South America. And then you can put big issues like global warming, whether it's a hoax or not, on top of that. Extremism, which, as Jerry Adams said a few years ago, they haven't gone away, you know. And then have just a casual look at the domestic politics of everywhere, from very close to home, across Europe and outwards. And it's an inward-looking, unaware of is perhaps too strong, but uninterested in context, inward-looking politics that is increasingly gathering strength. And when people look to themselves in a Machiavellian way, Machiavellian in the bad sense as opposed to read the Prince in the good sense, that does become problematic. And those of you that have read the Prince, you know, the classic critique of the Prince is that's all very well and is great if all you want to do is make your own country great again, but in so doing you're bound to cause friction with everybody else around you. And it strikes me that in all of that, and in the alliance mechanism that has broadly kept the peace that we've all enjoyed, the great stabilizer in that, regardless of the internal politics, has been the United States of America. And I don't think that we're in, over the next 4 years, and this is not a political point or a personal point at all, but we're not in for a stable ride, are we? Just the personality of Donald Trump, the methodology of Donald Trump, he has made his millions by belittling and destabilizing those that he is doing business with or in conflict with. Not the norm of international diplomacy. And he will, because that is him, he will go about his business and watch what he does, not necessarily what he says, but he will go about his business by attempting to destabilize those with whom he interacts. And that makes the business of balancing power very, very difficult and unpredictable. Many of you will have heard me say before that Thucydides famously said that humankind will only ever go to war for one of three reasons: fear, honor, or interest. I think he was broadly right, but he's missed out the fourth one, which is by mistake. And our research certainly tells us that by mistake is a large factor in almost every war, certainly every serious war that the world has found itself tumbling into. And I think that destabilizing factor, that lack of stability, that lack of a clear seesaw that one can add nuances of weight to keep balanced, against a background where signaling of a deterrence background, where a clarity and believability of signaled intent has been so important in keeping peace, is now actively no longer there, or certainly no longer so apparent. So our title is So What? And I think my trite answer to kick us off is so become ready, genuinely ready, not just as an army, not just as a political body, but as a national polity, as a nation, genuinely ready, as the purpose of the army suggests, to fight and win the nation's wars from the land. I think that is what the challenge is. I know that is what the challenge is telling the army. And then there's by implication, a secondary challenge, which I'll return to at the end, to make sure that everybody else, not just those actively engaged in the discussion who are interested in it, but everybody else becomes engaged usefully and properly in that discussion, because you can't, as a nation, be genuinely ready unless you have a genuine national discussion on the subject. So I think that's the so what. That's my attempt to cover the ground that would have been covered much more eruditely by three much more qualified folk than I, but I hope sets the context in which we're having the discussion, and in which Tim and Sebastian will take us through at least two pillars of that to set us up for about half an hour of conversation in the room. So Tim, if I can ask you to...
Well, thanks, Andrew, very much indeed. And thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. It's good to be back at Sandhurst. It's great to see Nick Cowley as the Commandant. I do get slightly nervous, even after 40 years in the Army, of being here with my hands in my pockets. I've never put my hands in my pockets here, but it's very good to be back. And good to be back with CHACR again after a few months. The overarching point you make, Andrew, I think, is that we are in an unstable, uncertain world. And I think alliances in this, I suppose, multipolar world that we now live in, some would say pluralistic, as opposed to multipolar world, is shaping the sort of geopolitical ecosystem in which we now find ourselves. And what that's meant is there's been an increase in alliances of all sorts, but all of them are security related in some form or another, whether that's political, regional alliances, law enforcement, financial, cultural. Frankly, all of them are connected to individual and collective security. So I'll just dig into that a little bit in the time available. When you look at the number of alliances around the world, having done some research, there's an estimated 3,488 multilateral alliances in the world, 264 of which are bilateral. So, I mean, that's a phenomenal number. And pre-1945, nations would probably have, I think, estimated 2.5 alliances that they were connected with. Now, it's 10.5. So that sort of in itself indicates that alliances have grown, and this sort of world that we live in, the access to technology and the globalization of the world means that we're far more connected, and therefore inevitably we'll have more alliances. There's 4 areas I think I would just touch on, and not to steal anybody else's thunder, but established, emerging, thematic, and then the unaligned, and some thoughts really for the future. So if you look at the established, what I would say established and evolving is probably the best way to describe it. And in that, there's about 20 international well-known institutions from the WHO, the UN, and so on, all linked to collective security of some form or other, whether in trade, finance, economics, etc. The UN Security Council was established in 45, NATO established in 49, still going strong. The former with non-permanent and permanent members, and the latter with 32 allies and 35 partner nations, importantly, which spreads the influence. And I'd put the EU in this first group as well. So with NATO, as Andrew said, 75 years old last year, a beacon of stability, has kept us safe for many, many years, has gone through, in the past 5 to 6 years, the most significant transition for some considerable time. On the back of a concept, which is a fairly academic concept called deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, came the implementation, and many in the room and many online will have been an integral to that. So a new strategic plan, replacing a plan that was completely outdated back to the sort of late 1960s. A strategic plan, and beneath that a family of regional plans, reinforced by a new force structure relating to those plans, a more appropriate C2, a redesigned minimum capability requirement, and really that recalibration, which happened 12 months before the invasion of Ukraine, set NATO up, and that invasion of Ukraine acted as a catalyst for this whole process of transition. And rather like the UN as well, I mean, the Charter hasn't particularly changed, but the Washington Treaty, which was the bedrock of NATO and still is the bedrock of NATO. And if you haven't read it, it's the most brilliant bit of writing, and so simple and straightforward, but it has held everybody together for the last 75 years. And I think that basis, and then the fact that NATO has continued to evolve and morph and transition, has meant that it's survived, like every good organization. And then you look at North Macedonia arriving in 2020, then the advent or the accession of Finland and Sweden, which I had the great honor to be part of, makes alliance cohesion still the center of gravity for these big organizations. And that really is something that we just need to protect. I'll come back to that later on. But alliance cohesion is effectively NATO's greatest challenge in terms of gaining consensus, but also its greatest strength when it does happen. So the second area is emerging. And in that area, I'll talk about sort of 4 key important areas. First, and coming home, is the Joint Expeditionary Force. I've never served in the Joint Expeditionary Force, so I had a great deal to do with it. But it's done the most extraordinary job since 2010. 10 nations, based on geography and culture, and is doing a really, really important role. Many in the room, as I say, and online will have been part of that. And what it really helped to do was to almost prod NATO into change as well. But it allowed a group of nations to come together at greater speed than perhaps NATO could do. I put it in the emerging bracket because it hasn't been fully tested yet, I would argue. The second one is AUKUS, which again is gaining huge relevance at the moment. Started in September 21, has 2 pillars for those unaware or not read into it quite yet. Pillar 1 is making Australia a nuclear-powered submarine nation, but not obviously nuclear armed. And then Pillar 2, perhaps less focus at the moment, but we hope we'll have more focus. 6 areas in Pillar 2: undersea capabilities, quantum AI, cyber, hypersonics, and EW. And under the leadership of, in London, of Damien Parmenter as the Director General and Kit Goldsmith, they are driving this forward with Australia and with the US. And I think that is definitely something to watch. And it's interesting, I thought that Rubio has been very supportive of that as he's come in as Secretary of State in the US. The third is the Quad, not UK related, US, Australia, India, and Japan. And maybe Sebastian will talk to that. It had a slightly false start in 2007, but it's come back with a vengeance in 2017. And really, the meeting that they've had 6 meetings, I think, between 20 and 24. And what that has done has really emphasized the focus on the Indo-Pacific. It's reinforced the rule-based international order in that area, and it's bolstered the security and prosperity in that area. And again, very interesting, I thought that Marco Rubio, his first meeting with foreign ministers on Tuesday after the inauguration was with those other 3 nations. But just as the West is sort of evolving, if you like, with NATO, the JEF, with AUKUS and with the Quad, so too I think the Global South is doing so. And we've talked about BRICS briefly already. Initially termed or styled by Jim O'Neill rather in Goldman Sachs back in 2001. This grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, with China very firmly in the lead, expanded to 10 with South Africa, Indonesia, India, Egypt, Ethiopia, and UAE. And then when you look at what happened in Kazan in October this year, or last year, there were a total of 32 delegations, of foreign delegations there. So what is it? I mean, is it a threat to NATO? Is it an alternative to NATO? I don't think it is. I think it's an economic trading forum, essentially. It's an alternative voice for the Global South. But interestingly, at Kazan, it talked about security for the first time. So one to watch as we go forward. It doesn't have a Washington Treaty equivalent. Maybe we'll have a Beijing Treaty one day, but at the moment, it doesn't have that. And then if you look at this sort of idea of an alternative forum, you know, my sense is that it's different in the sense that they all want different things. And Sebastian may disagree with that. But China wants to lead and wants an outlet for its Belt and Road Initiative and the chance to trade globally and wider with sanctions imposed upon it. For Russia, it's totally isolated, so therefore sees it as a comfort zone with nations around it. And then for India, I think is a chance really to, in some respects, to sit on a fence and watch both ways, which we'll come back to in a second. Sorry, forgive me. For Iran, it's seen as a sort of an option, again being isolated after the fall for Assad, fall of Assad and HTS taking over. So forgive me on India. I'll come back to that. when you leave that that sort of bricks and you sort of more and less comfortable, I suppose, is the crink, for want of a better phrase, with China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. The axis of evil, it's been called, the unholy alliance, the deadly quartet. There's no doubt it poses a competitive and aggressive threat to the West. Is it a challenge to NATO? Yes, it is. Is it the same as NATO? No, it's not, because it doesn't have that sort of unifying purpose other than not wanting to be supportive of the West and looking at a West as a sort of hypocritical sort of forum and set of nations. I think that meeting that took place recently in Kazan, where they aimed at de-dollarization, and I'm told though that when they tried to sort of suggest this, it was interesting that the only way they could pay for things in that forum was with the dollar, as the rest of the currencies wouldn't work. So I mean, I think they've got quite a long way to go, but definitely one to watch. The third area is on thematic, and I think this is something that's growing in interest. So there's always been thematic areas to consider, areas of common interest, and with global technology platforms growing, the democratization of issues, I think, is becoming greater, and we'll probably in some stage move away from that nation-state organization to more thematic. And to illustrate, I suppose you look at sort of, as Andrew's mentioned, the environmental change, climate change, migration, security around energy, security around data, security around health, food, water, to name but a few. These are all things that people care deeply about now, and you see organizations and alliances, security alliances, growing around those. Some global, so you look at Clean Energy Ministerial 2010, Climate and Clean Air Coalition of 2021. In there's 91 states and 107 non-state partners. And then you things like you've heard of the Mangrove Alliance and for climate change. And then on the regional side as well, there are organizations and initiatives growing up in Africa in particular, 14 African nations dealing with the Environmental Alliance and with the economy. And then in the Caribbean and Latin America, a number of nations came together in the Environmental Alliance and America organization. So these seem to be growing all the time now, and I can only see them getting more and more great as we go through this uncertain world. And then when you kick into data and AI as well, 10-state digital nation group, a 29-state global partnership on AI. I think the challenge with that, as these organizations grow up, will be to see whether or not governance can keep up with the exponential growth in technology. So definitely something to watch. And also in health too, as a sort of health security alliance. The WHO, 194 nations at the moment, and there's spawned from there regional health organizations. But all the way through, these new areas of data, health, energy, etc., they seem to be growing into new organizations. More challenges and increased numbers on both. And then finally, the fourth point I think is on unaligned. And again, Sebastian will talk more to this. But to me, there's a number of sort of fence sitters or hedgers or people who want to sort of be friends with the US and the West, but also want to slightly go their own way. And I would put in that area South Africa, I would put India, Brazil, Indonesia, and the importance of Saudi Arabia and Turkey into the future. Turkey in particular, and its pivotal geographical location, it's obviously a member of NATO, but it didn't get a chance to make a difference in Iraq, after Iraq. It wants to do that now in Syria. And it would be really interesting to see, I think, how that develops. But these are unaligned, effectively, totally unaligned nations, or nations that want to perhaps go both ways. So future challenges, Andrew, you've alluded to it in many respects. You know, so I see this as sort of established and evolving, the emerging, the thematic, and then the unaligned. But I think there's a number of questions for all of those alliances which we need to sort of think about. Firstly, as you've mentioned, you know, what does the second Trump administration look like? And I'm sure there'll be some discussion about that later on. Secondly, that all those alliances that are growing, having sat through NATO for the last 6 years, it's interesting to see what is the maximum size that they should be? Something to think about. You know, 32 nations, trying to get consensus at 32 is not easy. There must be a limit in some respects to how big these organizations can be. And I think that's something that BRICS will certainly find out. There are some pivotal nations which we'll touch on: Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India in particular. And then who is going to lead and have organizations relating to the global commons? That's an area that I think is lacking at the moment, and I think is rife for some form of organization to try and look after those. And then finally, I think for everybody, every nation and every organization is, in this uncertain world, the importance of supply chains and how those supply chains will work in the unstable world we live in. And that leads to the importance of either re-onshoring back to your own nation or ally shoring with people that you totally trust to make sure that those supply chains can work and the economies can still work. So let me pause there and hand you back. Thank you.
So Tim, thank you very much. Sebastian.
Yes, well, thank you so much. But before I do speak about non-aligned and specifically India, I want to thank you for this invitation to speak. I also have some memories of Sandhurst, rather poorer than yours, I'm afraid. I came here back when I was a student, when I took part in the Queen's Cup, playing rugby against Oxford, and I managed to break my ankle. So I can't imagine today's talk is going to be worse than being carried off in a stretcher. But, you know, if things do get that bad, then things really have crossed a threshold. But so, yeah, you know, India is in very many ways the archetypal non-aligned country. You know, as we all remember, it was the first, alongside the former Yugoslavia, to clearly articulate what non-aligned means back in the 1950s. But what often goes unnoticed is that the principles of the non-aligned movement were really articulated clearly by Nehru before independence. And it is perhaps for that reason that non-alignment is sort of part of the DNA of the modern state of India. And you know, it is precisely because India is non-aligned as a fence sitter, as you put it, that on the one hand, it can be a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and work alongside countries like Russia, like Belarus, like Iran and China. And yet, on the other hand, be a member of the Quad and operate alongside the US, Australia and Japan. Or to give another perhaps more often spoken about example, you know, India is non-aligned so it can buy cheap sanctioned Russian oil, whilst simultaneously purchasing advanced military technology from the US, including, of course, Predator drones and fighter jet engines, which will partially, in fact, be manufactured in India. There are a few riders on that, but I suspect that will go through. But you know, with all of that said, the fact that New Delhi intends to remain non-aligned, and we must understand it intends to remain non-aligned, does not mean that the UK, that the US, France, and other Western allies cannot form a meaningful security partnership with India in the Indo-Pacific. But if we are going to really get to that stage, we need to focus on shared national interests. And happily, when it comes to combating growing Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific, there is a great convergence of strategic interests between India and the West. So if we want to really fully grasp this, it's important to get an understanding of India's security landscape and how it understands its strategic competition with China. Now, to do that, a map is very beneficial. Do we have the map? I'm not sure. No, okay, well then I'm afraid you're going to have to use your imagination and memory of your atlas at home as I talk you around South Asia a little bit. So traditionally, India's focus has very much been on its ill-defined and hotly contested land borders with its, let's not forget, nuclear-armed neighbours, China and Pakistan. In the case of China, the two countries went to war in 1962 over their contested border. And the issue remains a live wire to this day. If we need any proof for that, we only have to go back to the Galwan Valley crisis of 2020. The Galwan Valley crisis was precipitated by Indian and Chinese troops coming into conflict along the border for the first time in several decades, leading to death on both sides. The crisis led to a severe escalation, again on both sides of the border, with thousands of troops and various weaponry being moved into the region over the course of the following months. If we move a little bit further west, we have, of course, as I've already said, another contested border, this time separating India from Pakistan. This is, of course, another highly volatile border dispute, but it's been further exacerbated over recent years due to the construction of CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which partially runs through what India, at least, considers to be Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Now, it is an absolutely crucial component of China's Belt and Road Initiative. I would argue the single most important component. It is a multi-billion-dollar project designed to link the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of northwest China to Pakistan's Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea. And though from New Delhi's perspective, there is a great deal to object to in this project, it is the prospect of having a Chinese-operated deep-sea port at Gwadar which really raises the most concern. So from here, if we travel round to the Maldives, so like several other countries in South Asia, the Maldives politics, the internal and foreign politics of the Maldives has really been reflecting the strategic competition between China and India in the region, with candidates and parties at least partially defining themselves along this axis. So in 2024, a pro-India party was replaced by a pro-China party, leading to further Chinese investment as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. If we move a little bit further east, we have Sri Lanka. So like the Maldives and Pakistan, Sri Lanka engaged with the Belt and Road project, which of course famously included the construction of the deep sea Hambantota port on its southern tip. Now, Delhi probably unfairly considers this a cynical, premeditated plan, but whether it was or whether it wasn't, Sri Lanka soon found itself unable to repay the Chinese loans, which funded the port's construction, resulting in China negotiating a 99-year lease to operate another deep-sea port on India's maritime borders. Now, Bangladesh and the deep-sea port at Chittagong are certainly important parts of this story, but another part which often gets missed is the deep-sea port at Chokpyu in Myanmar, in Burma, which I believe actually poses a much more significant threat to not only India, but to the Indian Ocean region as a whole. So it's not unlike Gwadar in Pakistan. Chokpyu sits at the end of Sea Mek, the China-Myanmar economic corridor. You see a pattern, and is another multi-billion-pound project which is designed to give China, yes, another deep-sea port in the Indian Ocean, and from India's perspective, importantly, in the Bay of Bengal itself. So if we take this together, and if you can imagine what that might look like on a map. It often gets called the string of pearls. I very much see it as a hangman's noose. And if you can imagine the way in which this containment strategy around India might look, you'll begin to see precisely why. But of particular concern is the possibility that China may be developing dual-use facilities under the guise of the Belt and Road Initiative in South Asia, and what today are expressly commercial projects aimed at enhancing regional connectivity and prosperity will, in the future, and perhaps the near future, be used as military installations, which will be capable, of course, of projecting power into the Indian Ocean region as a whole. So this takes us really back to the point I made at the start. If the UK and its allies wants to form a meaningful security partnership with India, then we must understand India's security landscape and focus on shared interests. Yeah? When you imagine that map, it's clear that there is a great deal of convergence of interests around maritime security and ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific. And indeed, there has been significant progress in this regard in recent years. The aforementioned Quad is an excellent example and is undoubtedly an important component of this. It brings together the four of the most important maritime nations in the Indo-Pacific, and this partnership is really only going to grow in significance, I believe, during Donald Trump's second term in office. Further, though India was once a somewhat reluctant member, it will be hosting the 2025 Quad Leaders Summit later this year. If you go back to 2017, India really was fence-sitting even more than it is today. And it was a very uncomfortable member of the Quad. Today, it is vocal in its support of the Quad. No, it's vocal that this is not an Asian NATO, but yes, it's an important part of the security apparatus of maritime security as India sees it. And the UK is also undoubtedly making progress. The Konkan naval exercises between the Indian Navy and the Royal Navy are certainly not new, but they've taken on added significance in recent years. Equally, high-level army visits and joint training programs have further reinforced ties between the UK and India's armed forces, as indeed has collaboration on defence technology. So, with all this said, there is undoubtedly much more which needs to be done to strengthen these partnerships with India. Though hoping New Delhi will decide to join a formal security alliance is no doubt currently fanciful. It is possible to forge a meaningful security partnership with India in the Indo-Pacific. And there are powerful shared interests to work with. So if we're talking about so what for Britain, the so what is focus on those shared interests. Thank you.
Brilliant. Sebastian, thanks very much. We've got about 15 minutes or so of conversation. I'm going to use the chair's privilege to ask the first question. And I'll keep the question brief, keep the answers brief, so we've got some time for the floor. But it's a huge question to both of you. So what does Trump's America mean for NATO and the alliances for the unaligned?
Shall I start? So on NATO, I think that, we've thought about this a lot in the last few years, and I think NATO is a very different place now than it was in 2016. And I think when President Trump looks, he'll see 24 nations which are now doing 2%. Probably not enough in terms of percentage, and certainly not enough in terms of nations, but it's a very different environment. He would be briefed on the fact that NATO has changed, that we now have new plans, new structures, new command and control, an allied reaction force led by NRDC Italy under Eldon Miller and others, which is, so it's a changed NATO that he sees. And the fears that we faced, I think, I personally think will not come out. I may be proved wrong, but I think the value of NATO will become evident, both in terms of the protection for Europe, but also the protection by extension of the Indo-Pacific. And the two are, I think, linked very, very closely. So will President Trump play hardball with NATO nations? Yes, I think he will. Do NATO need to stump up a little bit more? Personal view, yes, it probably does. But I don't think, and I hope I'm not proved wrong, that there will be anything completely catastrophic in terms of US relations with NATO, because it would be a fundamental change to the global system.
So the sort of the clacks and cries over Greenland, Denmark, and does he really understand what that means for NATO is a negotiating position as opposed to a threat to stability?
I can't obviously comment on what he's thinking, but so far in terms of NATO, I'm sort of quietly reassured at the moment.
Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when we're talking about Greenland and questions like this, we have to remember the art of the deal. If you read the art of the deal, you get a very clear insight into how Donald Trump tries to negotiate, and perhaps that is not something to be quite so worried about. And I would agree with you, I think Donald Trump does not necessarily mean negative consequences for NATO. I am very confident that it means very positive outcomes for the Quad. As indeed you mentioned, the day after Trump's inauguration, we immediately go into a foreign minister visit on the Quad. That's significant. The fact that the US media promoted that meeting as much as they did also emphasizes the fact that this wasn't something that happened on the sidelines. This is something which the US want to be seen as happening on the stage. It is therefore, I would argue, a clear message about this administration's attitude towards an open and secure Indo-Pacific and the role of the Quad in that process. As I also mentioned, we have the 2025 summit coming up, and that is supposed to be held in the latter half of 2025 in India. Now, I'm hearing some whispers coming out from Washington that Donald Trump perhaps wants to host it in the US and in the first half of 2025. I think moving it forward is a good thing. We don't have the time to procrastinate, and putting it on the center of the stage is, I would argue, a very good thing to do. Moving it out of India would be a very big mistake. It's been difficult to get it there, and I think it would be read as a slight in India. So yes, I hope Donald Trump moves it forward, and I hope it still takes place in India.
Thank you. Out into the room. Let's go there and then there.
So, Lieutenant Colonel Ollie Major, the British Army's liaison officer to Germany for force development, which gives some interesting perspectives. The UK's position internationally since the sort of late 1950s has probably been well defined by Harold Macmillan's description of us as the honest broker, which of course was promptly satirised by Peter Cook, because saying that no nation could be more honest and no nation could be broker, and that's 50% true still today, I think. The question is, though, we have a habit of behaving like that as a nation, trying to be all things to all people. And we're in General Tim's list of alliances. We're in an awful lot of those, a number of which have cross-cutting effects which impact each other, even before you start thinking about our reaches to try and reach out into the Indo-Pacific region and start doing military cooperation with India and places like that. And I would pick the example of the JEF, which, as General Tim said, was hugely useful, but probably now needs appraising about whether the regional plans and the CHACR strategic plan have made it redundant because we've fixed the problem it was set up to achieve. And my question is, are we as a nation seeking to do too much with too many in this international web of space, rather than genuinely sitting back and thinking what is essential to us and important to us, but particularly for the British Army, which is going to find it really difficult to get vehicles to the Indo-Pacific region quickly. Should we be cutting our cloth accordingly with CGS's difficult financial choices and reining back and doing a bit of a review of where we actually should be focusing?
That's for you, Tim.
Okay. Well, thanks, Ollie. I think, the military, as we all know, is just a part of the wider government, and there is a whole raft of people, not just military, involved in alliances. And so the diplomatic effort that the Foreign Office is doing every day in far-off places to have influence is incredibly important. If you're talking specifically about the UK, we've got NATO, we've got AUKUS, we've got nuclear, and we've got homeland, effectively. After that, there's some very hard choices to make, I think. The specific question about the JEF, I don't think it's quite the time yet to stop the JEF. I think the JEF is a very successful organisation, and let's be honest as well. I mean, NATO has transformed, but has not been tested. It's being tested, and having run the training and set up this new training regime, you know how it needs to be tested fully. So I think it would be wrong, and I think it was a very wise move to set up the JEF, and I think it's done extremely well with this like-minded group of, and geographically, culturally like-minded folk. So yes, there's some hard decisions to make for the Chief of Defence Staff and for the Secretary of State and for the CGS. But having been with him last week on the SROB, I left feeling positive and enthused about what I'd heard. Are we taking on too much? We've always wanted to have influence in the world, but it's not just military influence that gives us that influence. There's a raft and a ton of other things that help us do that. So militarily, I think we're in the right place. I think the CGS has got a very good vision for the Army about where he wants to take us. So I'm not as concerned as you are, I think, Ollie, at this point.
Thanks, Sharpe. When we talk to our US officers and citizen uniform, they're very focused on the war we're trying in 2027. Whether that happens by design or, as Andrew suggested, by mistake, what would India do? How do you think they might position themselves? And what would NATO's role be in that sort of conflict?
Well, very much depends, of course, upon what happens between now and 2027 in terms of Western engagement with India. Is India ever going to be a full member of an alliance? Is India going to act like the UK, like Japan? No, it's not. But again, focusing on shared interest will enable India to play a role probably in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region. If there is a blockade, a quarantine, an outright invasion of Taiwan, I can't imagine India mobilizing in any meaningful way. It has too many interests with China, and it is how do you put it, a fence sitter. It is not going to commit itself in that kind of a way. But focusing on shared interests will lead to positive outcomes.
Can I just point out, fence is not a derogatory term?
No, I quite appreciate it. It hadn't occurred to me. I think it sums it up rather well.
And it's worth adding, if I may, there's a palpable tension. In Delhi, New Delhi, a couple of years ago, speaking to the Indian Army, there is a tension between the nationalist, the Modi politics, the undesirability of conversation with the West and Britain in particular. But in the Gymkhana Club, the Polo Club, and the messes of the Indian Army, unable to see their way to rearming themselves with Russian equipment that is either not available or not desirable or sanctioned, and working out how to have a conversation with Britain in particular, but also America against that background, has produced a genuine tension that makes sitting on the fence, sitting in the middle, looking both ways, almost the only place to be. And the "it depends" answer, I mean, spot on. It depends.
Nick, in terms of NATO, when NATO's borders are threatened, 32 come together pretty quickly, and I saw that actually happen. When it happened, when Russia went to Ukraine, on the back of the comments by President Trump in his first administration and Macron, NATO's brain dead, and then you see people come together in that way was phenomenal and an extraordinarily historic experience. But that was on NATO's borders where 32 people came together. What I think you probably more likely have is almost a sort of Jeff equivalent, a sort of coalition of the willing, bilateral arrangements to support something that happened in Taiwan. I don't know that it's not based on anything or on any plans, but bringing 32 nations with you might be challenging. So therefore, I sense it's probably not going to be a NATO event. It's more likely, because it's going to happen pretty quickly, to be something slightly more bespoke, I would imagine. Yeah. It's a good thought.
And informed by I was watching a discussion in quite an erudite forum where people were saying, well, so what of Article 5 if America and China go to war? Immediately we're all involved. And the American said, it strikes me that there's a clue in the title. Last time I looked, neither America nor China in that context are in the North Atlantic. So how does Article 5 apply? And I think there is a degree of ignorance about the assumption that it's a global alliance. It's not. It is very specific in its contract.
That said, I think Stoltenberg did come out and reference China in a number of communiques. So it's on the radar, but trying to galvanize people behind one mission might be challenging.
Yeah. So it depends. It becomes the answer again. I'm going to push the boundaries because I think that we're getting more value out of this than we will out of a cup of coffee, and we're going to keep going for another 10 minutes or so. So let's have at least two more questions. Let's go one and then two. Yeah.
One emerging thematic but undeclared alliance is the so-called tech bros. Sat behind President Trump at his inauguration, a dominance of the global digital commons. What do you think their impact on the context is going to be?
Personally, I think it's going to be pretty huge, however long that relationship lasts for. There's no doubt that the rise of technology is trying to be harnessed. There's a competition being created between China and the US, and arguably with the Prime Minister's announcement about AI, the UK wants to be in third spot, and why not? Actually, we've got the will and the intellect in many respects to do that. We just need to put the money there. So when you look at quantum, when you look at other things, we need to invest in this. So I think it's going to be really, really important, and I think it's an opportunity more than anything else for the UK to get involved. In terms of the US, I mean, it's unsure, and I think to the point about the China piece, everyone's trying to work out whether they're commercial partner or strategic competitor, frankly, and I think it's probably both, and as Andrew says, it probably depends. So that probably doesn't answer your question fully, but I definitely want to watch. I would question how long the effect will happen with those individuals though.
At that point that you make about partner or actually adversary, I think is absolutely key to many countries, but most of all to Australia. Australia is going to have to make a key decision between prosperity and security. And that's going to be a difficult decision, particularly when it comes to a domestic conversation. Where will it go? It will go for security, there's no doubt about it. But yes, internally there is that conversation happening. Yeah.
Without putting you on the spot, does Australia have a view on that? Putting you on the spot.
Very much on the spot. I'm going to pass over to John.
It's certainly a difficult conversation, and sometimes the public discourse in that area is quite immature. But I think there is messaging getting out there that defense really does matter, and that Ukraine was a wake-up call, as distant as it is geographically. Conceptually, people are coming around to the idea that maybe the world's not as nice a place as we thought about. So there'll definitely be work, but I think we can have that conversation.
Thank you.
Nick Conrad back in the RMC fellow at the moment. My question bounces off the idea of the non-aligned status of something like India. And I've worked very closely with Tanzania in the last couple of years, who are also pathologically non-aligned. And I think they would object to this term, hence said that they would very much see themselves as just cultivating their own allotment, as it were. And I wonder, are we now in an age where perhaps we ought to be abandoning our talk of values and defending values? Could we think, message and talk about that a lot? It lays open to a lot of hypocrisy, accusations of hypocrisy, and it very undermines us in the eyes of a lot of us in the world, especially those that are non-aligned. And I wonder, should we just perhaps be a little bit more honest with ourselves and each other about looking purely in terms of shared interests, identifying the parameters of those interests and pursuing them more doggedly?
Sebastian, I think that's for you, and I suspect we'll come back to that in the discussion after coffee as well. Great question.
Well, I want to say first of all that I'm blaming General Tim for any talk of fence sitter. I'm distancing myself from that comment because yes, you are quite right. And it would also be very true of India. It's not looking to play both sides, it's trying to play its own side. Yeah, point absolutely taken. If I understand your question correctly, I completely agree with you. I think there is far too much emphasis on shared values and not enough emphasis on shared interests. If there's one thing I hope you take away is shared interests is where we need to go. If you just look at the last few years, you can see how playing both shared interests and shared values has worked out. On the one side, there have been major steps forward, both for the UK, the US and France in terms of integrating and creating that defence partnership with India. But the moment value starts getting dragged into it, we end up in a quagmire. And much of this is because in our psyche, we view India as a democracy, which of course it is, the largest democracy, and a surprisingly healthy democracy, despite much of the media reporting earlier last year. But nevertheless, when we try to both hold India accountable for failings in its democracy, whilst at the same time trying to pursue common interests, we end up going round in circles and it becomes genuinely counterproductive. And India is very adverse to hearing criticisms of its democracy and will often quite gently allude to what it sees as the multiple failings in other democratic countries which are criticising it.
Yeah, and I'd just observe on top of that in a conversation not dissimilar to this in the USI in New Delhi a couple of years ago, with Rana Chinna, the CHACR fellow in the USI in New Delhi, talking about shared values. And he remarked, "I'm not even sure that we share the concept of values," which I thought was a brilliant answer. There's a degree of arrogance and hubris in an assumption that we're all talking the same language when we talk values as a concept. We've got time for one more question if there is one. Obviously,
So, thank you. Mark Baxter, currently serving at MOD main building. I wondered if the panelists, would you have any observations on, in regard to alliances and or non-aligned relationships for the UK's 100-year pledge of support to Ukraine? What are the threats? What are the opportunities? So the Prime Minister recently pledged support to Ukraine for 100 years, basically to support in whatever way necessary for as long as it takes. What sort of interpretation of his words? Not so much.
And your question around that, sorry, is?
In view of alliances, where do you think are the opportunities are for the UK within alliances, and then I suppose depending on where the opportunities and or threats in relationships to non-aligned relationships, either with Ukraine itself or with other countries?
So we need to have another chat over coffee, I think. But yeah, in terms of alliances, I think we've got it pretty much right at the moment. You know, we have in NATO, for example, we have our equity is pretty strong. In AUKUS, we're moving in the right direction. In relation to Ukraine, you know, we are doing the right thing at the moment. And I think our overall focus on the alliances that we're involved in, I think is right at the moment. I don't think we've got capacity to do a great deal more, as we've talked about earlier on. But I think we must continue to focus on NATO, and we must continue, I think, to focus on AUKUS and the great work that started there. And if I have one concern, it's about how much effort is going into Pillar 2 of AUKUS. I think there's a lot more that we could potentially do there. I think there's some fantastic work being done in MOD in terms of creating a trellis upon which that Pillar 2 can grow, and the framework that's been created. But I think it's very easy for that just to fall off the perch as we focus on Pillar 1. So I think NATO are in a good place. AUKUS, a little bit more work on that. And in terms of Ukraine, you know, we've supported Ukraine hugely, and we will continue to do so until the political masters tell us not to.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, if I shift emphasis slightly from the Ukraine towards Taiwan, but keep the same question as I understand it the same, you see in the South China Sea in particular, you see an awful lot of relationships, bipartisan relationships between the US and different actors. And I think that discourages a broader alliance to build. You know, Japan and the US are aligned, Philippines and the US are aligned. So why should Japan and the Philippines align with one another? Why should one go to war if the Senkaku Islands are attacked, or if you know, the second Tommy Shaw incident goes hot? So yeah, that's something to be careful of, to make sure that alliances are not undermined by that.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. I mean, I hope you feel that was an extremely useful and thought-provoking session. It seems to me that I mean, I don't think there's any dispute, and I think we'll feel even more so after coffee that we do live in interesting, difficult and dodgy times in which there's plenty of room for calculation and mistake, and plenty of room for it depends as being the answer to almost everything. And I'm not sure that people really think deeply about the combination or the balance between the fact that from alignment you get both strength but also a commitment to responsibility. And that people are prepared to genuinely make that commitment in more than words when they seek strength through alignment or self-reliance through non-alignment. and finding a balance between alignment and commitment to the right organisations that are going to bring value, I think remains extremely important. I mean, I'm much older than anybody else here, including you, Tim, and so I definitely remember my O-level history origins of the First World War compulsory for every child in Britain. And it seems to me that the step from splendid isolation into Entente agreement, Entente cordiale, and a deliberate decision to be bilateral rather than multilateral in the nations by calculation in order to be safe, in order to be responsible, in order to choose very carefully where one makes commitment and alignment, actually had the opposite effect in the end. And Britain does not go to war as a result of a chosen alignment, but the fact that there's an ancient treaty with, to coin the phrase of the time, brave little Belgium. And feel that they've learnt huge lessons from that, and less than a generation later find themselves in those same clipped received pronunciation terms going to war over plucky little Poland. And just thinking through and referring to my earlier remarks about the centrality of NATO to UK security policy, balanced against the ignorance of NATO, not just within the army, but let alone within the army, but across the wider polity of the UK, I think is an indicator of the fact that we've allowed ourselves to get into a world where we rather take our security for granted. And I think the message of this morning is that not just the British Army, but that we collectively mustn't. Thank you. That was an extremely useful session. Thank you, Sir Tim, Dr. Sebastian. If I can ask everybody to take 15 minutes over coffee, be back at 1:45, and to thank our two panellists for their contribution this morning.